Okay, so this will be a shorter one. I want to talk about the game we had last night. It's in Knox's Kitty Imagination Time, and that's a very kind of malleable setting because it's cats. You're playing a cat that's playing D&D, so it's it can be basically anything. And there's kind of like a soft rule that literally anything can change. Just like, there were a few times I asked Knox, like, oh, can I have inspiration? Why? I just want it. And it worked the one time because the one player popped in, answered a question sort of correctly, and got inspiration. So that was funny. But afterwards, we were talking about Horde mechanics and running big groups of enemies. And because that's what this game was. We were running a ton of enemies. There was like it was like a wave-centric game where, we had a bit of a downtime. We could do some stuff, and then a new wave would start, and enemies would come in. And it was like, 60 enemies, 80 enemies, 100 enemies at a time. Most of them are, quote, fodder. They're smaller guys, and then there's a few, like, bigger hero units that are essentially, like, player characters, more or less. Or at least truncated versions of them. Like, there's a wizard that has some spells, there's a fighter, blah, 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 all that stuff. But what I really want to talk about is, there's like so many there's been so much discussion over the past 50 years on how to run a shitload of enemies. And there's a lot of approaches you can take. There's the simple horde mechanics or minion mechanics, minionized enemies, where they all have 1 HP. And that accomplishes two things. One, it makes minions much easier to run. Much easier to run because you don't have to track HP for 60 enemies. Then it makes them easier to run, simpler, and then also it makes the players feel a little more powerful, especially if you do this in a campaign where, like at the start of the game they're fighting goblins and it's normal, and then at level 6 they fight 40 goblins and they're all minionized. Now the players are like instantly killing the things that used to actually take like an attack or two, even though I think, how much HP do goblins have? Like 12? 8 maybe? Something like that. You should still come in one hit, but if you roll low on the damage you might not. But either way, it's like these things that used to be dangerous now aren't, or at least you can kill them way easier. You're cutting through swaths of them, and especially you can do, they all have 1 HP, but when fighting minionized hordes you get cleave rules, and basically the damage you do is how many you kill. But then you're essentially getting into swarm mechanics, where each HP represents a member of the swarm, which is like weirder to do with like human-sized enemies, but it also kind of works, and those are kind of the same thing mechanically. So like that's one way to do it, but then if they're minionized, you can't really differentiate different minions without like really thinking outside the box. Like, but that is a creative space you can play with. Like, there were 3 different, or I'm talking about 3 basic fodder enemies we were fighting last night. There's the Angry Boys, which were they're like barbarian kind of stand-ins. The way they were designed, they had damage resistance and pack tactics, essentially. So they got bonuses for more of their own kind around. There were looter boys, which would run in and try to steal our treasure because we were dragons. And they just ignored difficult terrain. And they could move through spaces. And all they did was try to steal our crap. Then there were there was a basic third one. I'm blanking. There were the digger boys, and they were those were kind of annoying, but I'll get to those. Their gimmick was good, but it was annoying, and that's kind of the point. There's one I'm leaving out. There were the zombie boys, but they came in later. Okay, we'll just talk about those. So, like, I think there were basic good boys too, but we didn't see them towards the end. So, like, I guess the basic good boy you have in the basic, yeah, they were all dogs. So the basic idea would be you have a basic unit. They just have an attack, they do an amount of damage, and they die in one hit. Then you have the angry good boys, which, if they're minionized, how do you differentiate that? Do they just ignore the first instance of damage they take? How do you work with that? I don't know. What's the best way to work with that? Off the top of my head, I can't exactly think of anything. But maybe they just have, because they're minionized, there's like certain ways you can do it, like they can avoid damage or something. And one of the main things is whenever a save and throw effect would cause damage, if they make the save, they take no damage. That's also one of the basic ideas here. Damn. But one of the other things, I think I brought this up, the way the wound system in Daggerheart works, where there's damage thresholds. And it's like, if you do under a certain threshold of damage, then you don't do any wounds of damage. I think they call them hearts. I don't know. But if you do under this threshold, you don't do any, real damage. It's superficial damage. If you do above that threshold, then you do 1 wound. And if you do above a second threshold, you do 2 wounds. It's that kind of, it works that way. So if you make it that way, you can still reward players for building into damage instead of just having an attack and not worrying about how much damage they do. So, that works. Or you can differentiate it by say attack, or you can kind of do it by vibes. That breath weapon that was a really good roll. This will do 2 wounds and a wound on a fail. But really, maybe a breath weapon should do that anyway. 2 wounds minimum and then 1 on a fail. But I feel like the wound HP kind of threshold or damage threshold kind of works well. You still reward players for doing more damage, but you also no longer have HP to track. It's just when the damage happens, you then do some math. You do math to figure out how much wounds they take instead of how much HP they have left. That kind of thing. So that could work, especially if it's on saving throws, on spells that do just damage, say a fireball, then it does 2 wounds, it's damage threshold, so it's entirely based on damage threshold. So I think that would work just fine. That's definitely one way to do it. But I think there's a lot of ways to do it, especially with lots of enemies like that. And it also made certain things kind of more valuable. Normally, for picking a breath weapon or a spell, you're not a line isn't very good. It's really difficult to get a lot of enemies lined up. Like, you're just going to find kind of more success with something like Fireball, where it's a radius. In normal D&D combats with, like, you know, maybe 10 enemies. But in these giant groups, a line weapon, a line breath weapon was getting fucking like 20 dudes a shot, 25 dudes a shot. Or I don't even know if there were that many, but it's like way easier to get a lot of them because there's so many of them. There's lots of different angles where you can like shoot through the whole horde. So that's a nice little wrinkle that was interesting. Because normally something like a cone is just going to be better. You're going to get like, you know, a smaller grouping of enemies, but that's all you really have is smaller groupings of enemies. So that's all I really got today. I just wanted to talk about a few of those things, and there'll be some more discussion about them. But yeah, that's it for today.